My name is Albert Thorne, and I've been a night shift ranger at Yosemite National Park for 15 years. Most people think rangers just help lost hikers and warn folks about bears. Well, that's true during the day, but at night, things are different. Really different. I used to love the quiet darkness of Yosemite at night, the way moonlight turns half-dome into a silver ghost, the soft hooting of owls, the rustle of pine needles in the wind. But that was before the attack started. It began 3 weeks ago. I was doing my usual rounds, checking on our ranger stations spread across the park. The first sign something was wrong was at Pine Creek Station. The wooden door was ripped clean off its hinges. Inside, it looked like a tornado had hit. Papers everywhere, chairs broken, claw marks on the walls. Not bear marks, these were different. I radioed it in, thinking maybe we had some troublemakers. But then 2 nights later, Maple Ridge Station was hit the same way, and Eagle Point after that. Something was attacking our stations, moving from one to the next like it had a map. Something smart. Something that wasn't afraid of humans. That's when I volunteered to work extra night shifts. Someone had to figure out what was happening. I just wish I'd known then what I know now. Maybe I could have saved them. Maybe I could have stopped it before we started losing rangers. But let me tell you the whole story. And please, if you ever find yourself in Yosemite after dark, stay in your car. Stay where it's safe. Because what's out there in the darkness, it's still hunting. The first night I started investigating, I took my truck up to Glacier Point Station. Mike Reynolds was on duty there, good guy. Been working the park almost as long as me. When I pulled up, something felt off. The air was too still, like right before a storm hits. No crickets chirping, no night birds, just dead silence. I found Mike sitting at his desk, pale as a ghost. His hands were shaking as he held his coffee mug. "You gotta listen," he whispered. "They've been out there for hours." I was about to ask who when I heard it, a sound that made my skin crawl. It was like a wolf's howl, but wrong somehow. Too deep, almost human-like. Then another answered from the other side of the station. And another. "They're surrounding us," Mike said. "I tried radioing for help, but there's just static." We spent that whole night huddled in the station, listening to those things circle us. Sometimes we'd hear scratching on the walls, sometimes heavy breathing right outside the windows, but they never showed themselves. When dawn finally came, they were gone. But they left us a message, deep claw marks all around the station, forming a perfect circle, like they were marking their territory. Or maybe marking us. The next night, Danny Green disappeared from Sentinel Station. We found his radio, his flashlight, and a trail of blood leading into the woods. That's when we knew this wasn't just about damaging stations anymore. They were hunting us, picking us off one by one. Nobody wanted to believe what I was saying about the howls, about the sounds that were too human. The Park Service sent in wildlife experts, but they couldn't explain the claw marks or the coordinated attacks. They talked about aggressive bears, maybe a pack of wolves. But I knew better. We all did, deep down. We just didn't want to admit what we were really dealing with. It was a week after Danny disappeared when I finally saw one of them. I was alone at Cedar Grove Station, watching the forest through my binoculars. The moon was full that night, making everything look silver and strange. At first, I thought it was just a shadow moving between the trees. But then, it stepped into a clearing, and my heart nearly stopped. It looked like a wolf, but it was huge, taller than a man when it stood on its back legs. Its fur was dark gray, almost black, and its eyes glowed yellow like lanterns in the dark. But the worst part was how it moved. Not like an animal at all. It walked on two legs, its head turning left and right like it was searching for something, like it was thinking. I grabbed my radio, trying to warn the other stations, but all I got was static, just like the night with Mike. That's when I noticed the silence again. No wind, no animals, nothing. Then I heard something heavy land on the roof. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Dust fell from the ceiling as whatever was up there walked around. Its claws made scraping sounds against the wood. Then I heard that deep howl again, but this time it was right above me. Two more howls answered from the forest. They were using teamwork, I realized. One would get on the roof to scare us out, while the others waited in the woods. That's probably what happened to Danny. The next few nights were like a nightmare. We lost contact with Turner Point Station, then Carson Valley. Each time we'd find the same scene: doors ripped open, claw marks everywhere, and no sign of the Rangers except for some blood and torn clothes. We tried everything: better locks, security cameras, armed patrols. But those things were smart. They'd wait until a station was vulnerable, then attack all at once. The cameras would go dead just before each attack, like they knew how to cut the power. One night I found a map in Mike's station. He'd been marking where each attack happened. That's when I saw it. They weren't just random attacks. They were moving in a pattern, taking out stations one by one, working their way toward the center of the park, toward my station. But knowing their pattern didn't help, because by then there were only 3 of us left on night shift, and I had a terrible feeling they'd saved us for last. Last Thursday night, everything fell apart. I was at my station when I got a call from Mike. His voice was shaking so bad I could barely understand him. "They got Sarah," he said. "I heard her screaming at Valley View Station." By the time I got there, he went quiet for a moment. There was blood everywhere, Al, and I saw them clearly this time. 3 of them. They're not running away anymore. They just stood there, watching me. "Mike, listen to me. Get to my station right now. We need to stick together. I'm on my way." There was a pause, then, "Wait. I think I hear something outside my truck." The radio cut off. I tried calling him back. Nothing, just static. I knew I should go look for him, but that's what they wanted. That's how they got Danny and the others, picking us off when we tried to help each other. For hours, I sat in my station, jumping at every sound. The radio stayed dead. My phone had no signal. I was completely alone. Around midnight, something changed. The air got colder, and I started hearing those howls again. But this time, they were different, almost like they were laughing. I grabbed my flashlight and looked out the window. There, nailed to a tree, was Mike's jacket. It was torn and bloody. That's when I knew. I was the last one left. The scratching started soon after, first at the back door, then the windows, then the roof, all at once. They weren't trying to hide anymore. They wanted me to know they were there, wanted me to be scared. I could see their shadows moving past the windows. 3 of them. The biggest one kept standing up on its back legs, so tall its head blocked out the moon. They were playing with me, like a cat plays with a mouse before it eats it. I knew I had 2 choices. I could try to run for my truck, or I could make my last stand right here. Either way, this was going to end tonight. That's when I remembered something important. something that might save my life. There was a reason these creatures attacked our stations. They were looking for shelter. Every time they destroyed a station, they'd use it as their new den until they moved on to the next one. Well, if they wanted my station so badly, maybe they could have it, but not the way they planned. I grabbed the emergency gas can we kept for the generator and started splashing it everywhere, on the walls, the floor, the furniture. My hands were shaking, but I worked fast. The howls outside got louder, more excited. They could probably smell the gas. Just as I finished, the windows exploded inward. Glass flew everywhere as the three dogmen crashed through. In the light of my flashlight, I could see them clearly now, their gray fur matted with dirt and blood, yellow eyes glowing, teeth longer than my fingers. The biggest one stood up on its back legs. It was almost 8 feet tall, with muscles rippling under its fur. To my shock, it tried to speak. The sound was horrible, like someone trying to talk with a mouth full of rocks. But I could make out one word: last. I took a step back, holding up my lighter. Yeah, I'm the last one. And you know what? I'm tired of being afraid. They moved closer, spreading out to surround me. They didn't seem worried about the lighter. Maybe they didn't understand, but they would. The big one lunged at me. At the same moment, I flicked the lighter and threw it behind me. The gas caught instantly. Fire raced across the floor and up the walls faster than I expected. The dogmen howled, not their usual howls, but screams of surprise and fear. They tried to get back to the windows, but I'd splashed extra gas there. The flames were everywhere now. I ran for the back door, the only place I hadn't put gas. Behind me, I could hear them crashing into things, howling as the fire caught their fur. The smoke was getting thick. My eyes were burning. Just before I reached the door, I felt claws rake across my back. One of them had almost got me, but I yanked the door open and threw myself outside, rolling down the short hill beside the station. From the bottom of the hill, I watched my station burn. The dogmen's howls got weaker, then stopped. Black smoke poured from every window. The whole building creaked and groaned as the fire ate through the walls. I stayed there until dawn, watching it burn, making sure nothing came out. When the fire trucks finally came at sunrise, I told them it was an electrical fire. What else could I say? Nobody would believe the truth. They found no bodies in the ashes, but I wasn't surprised. I had a feeling those things had burned away to nothing, like a bad dream. The Park Service gave me 2 weeks off to recover from the accident. The claw marks on my back needed 20 stitches, but I told the doctors it was from falling through a broken window while escaping the fire. They seemed to believe that. I'm back at work now, but at a different station. Working days, not nights. The attacks have stopped completely. Most people say it was probably just bears or wolves that moved on to another part of the woods. They've already started rebuilding the stations we lost. But sometimes, on my drive home at sunset, I catch myself looking at the shadows between the trees. And every now and then, on very quiet nights, I think I hear howling in the distance, deeper than a wolf's howl, almost human-like. Because I know something nobody else does. We only got 3 of them that night, and in all the attacks before, I'd seen at least 5 different sets of tracks. That means there are still 2 out there, somewhere in Yosemite's dark forests, waiting, watching, planning, and sometimes I wonder if they're looking for revenge. My name is Russell Warren, and I've been a backcountry ranger at Rocky Mountain National Park for 8 years now. Most folks think I've got the best job in the world, spending my days in these beautiful mountains, helping lost hikers, and making sure everyone stays safe. Well, at least that's how it used to be, before the winter of 1963 changed everything. I remember that year like it was yesterday. The aspens had just started turning golden, and the first dustings of snow were touching the highest peaks. Everything seemed normal at first. I'd do my usual rounds, checking the trails, fixing markers, and chatting with hikers about bear safety. My little cabin near Bear Lake was my favorite place in the world, with its creaky wooden floors and the old potbelly stove that kept me warm during the cold nights. But then I started noticing things that didn't quite fit. It began with strange marks carved into the trees, not your typical trailblazes or the occasional vandalism from teenagers. These were different. They looked ancient somehow, like they'd been there for hundreds of years. Yet I knew that wasn't possible because I'd walked these same trails just days before and hadn't seen them. The symbols were what got to me the most. They weren't random scratches, they had a pattern to them, almost like a language. Some looked like twisted arrows pointing to the deeper parts of the forest, while others reminded me of stick figures with two long arms. At first, I thought maybe some kid was playing games, but these marks were carved deep into the bark, higher than most people could reach without a ladder. I didn't know it then, but those marks were the first warning signs of what was coming. If only I'd paid more attention, maybe things would have turned out differently. Maybe I would have understood sooner what was really happening in my beloved mountains. And maybe, just maybe, I'd still have all my toes to wiggle in my boots. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you exactly how it all started, and why these mountains I've called home will never feel quite the same again. It was late October when the first hiker went missing. Jim Peterson, a local guy who knew these trails better than most. That's what made it so strange. Jim wasn't some tourist who'd wandered off the path. He'd been coming here since he was a kid. The day I got the call about Jim, I noticed more of those weird symbols had shown up. This time they were all over the trees near Glacier Gorge, carved in deep and fresh. The bark around them was still light-colored, like an open wound on the tree. I took some photos with my old camera, thinking I'd show them to the other rangers at our next meeting. That evening, while I was making my rounds, something stopped me in my tracks. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It was like that, but worse. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just dead silence. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. I stood there, my flashlight beam cutting through the growing darkness, when I heard it, a sound I'd never heard before in all my years in these mountains. It was like a mix between a deep growl and a whistle, but not from any animal I knew. 3 more hikers disappeared that week. Each time we'd find their backpacks or water bottles near trees with those same strange markings. The weird thing was, there were never any signs of struggle. It was like they just vanished. I started keeping a journal of everything I saw. The symbols seemed to be telling a story, or maybe marking a territory. They always appeared in groups of 3 or 4, and they were getting more common as you went deeper into the backcountry. I drew each new one I found, trying to make sense of them. One night, while I was looking through my notes, my radio crackled to life. Through the static, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't words exactly, but a series of deep, rhythmic sounds, almost like the markings on the trees had come alive and were trying to speak. I knew I should tell someone about what was happening, but who would believe me? Missing hikers were one thing, but mysterious symbols and strange noises in the night, They'd think I was losing my mind. Little did I know, things were about to get much worse, and those symbols were just the beginning. The first snow fell early that November, and that's when I found the footprints. Not regular footprints. These were huge, nearly twice the size of my boot. At first, I thought someone was playing a prank, but the tracks went straight up a slope so steep that no person could have climbed it. I followed the prints as far as I could, taking pictures with shaking hands. They led me to a clearing I'd never seen before, even though I thought I knew every inch of this park. The trees here were different. Their trunks were covered in those symbols, but these looked older, worn by time and weather. Something caught my eye in the snow. A torn piece of Jim Peterson's red jacket, frozen stiff. That night in my cabin, I couldn't sleep. The wind was howling outside, but underneath it, I kept hearing something else, heavy footsteps in the snow and what sounded like low, rumbling voices. Not human voices. Something else. I started putting the pieces together. The symbols always appeared before someone went missing. They were warnings, I realized, or maybe territory markers. Whatever was making them didn't want us in their part of the mountains. The next day, I found something that made my heart stop. Near one of the marked trees was a clump of thick, dark hair caught in the bark. It wasn't from any animal I knew, too coarse for a bear, too long for a mountain lion. I put it in a plastic bag, planning to take it to someone who might know what it was, but I never got the chance. That evening, the storm hit. Not just any storm, the worst blizzard I'd seen in my 8 years here. The radio warned everyone to stay indoors, but I had to check on the last group of hikers who'd signed in that morning. That's when everything went from bad to worse. I grabbed my emergency pack and headed out into the whiteout conditions. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked me over, and the snow was falling so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. But I kept going, following my instincts and the trail I knew by heart. That's when I heard them. Through the howling wind came those deep, rumbling sounds again. But this time, they were all around me. And in the swirling snow, I started seeing shapes, big shapes, moving shapes. I wasn't alone out here, and I was pretty sure I had just walked right into their trap. I couldn't see much through the snow, but I could feel them getting closer. The shapes in the storm were massive. They must have been at least 8 feet tall. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of dark, shaggy fur and eyes that glowed like amber in the darkness. My legs were shaking, but I couldn't run. The snow was too deep, and I knew they could move much faster than me. I backed up against a tree, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear the storm anymore. That's when I saw them clearly for the first time. There were 5 of them. A family, I realized with a shock. 2 huge adults, taller than any man I'd ever seen, covered in thick, dark fur. Behind them were 2 younger ones, probably teenagers by their size. And there was a little one holding on to what must have been its mother's leg. They looked almost human, but not quite. Their faces were flatter, their arms longer, their shoulders massive under all that fur. I expected them to attack, but they didn't. They just stood there, surrounding me, making those deep, rumbling sounds to each other. I started to understand. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were protecting their home. All those symbols, the missing hikers, everything. They were just trying to keep people away from their territory. But the storm was getting worse. The temperature was dropping fast, and my fingers were starting to go numb. The bigger one, probably the father, made a sound that seemed almost like a warning. Then they all backed away, disappearing into the whiteness of the storm like ghosts. I tried to move, to find my way back to my cabin, but I was lost. The snow had covered my tracks, and everything looked the same in the blizzard. My feet were so cold I couldn't feel them anymore. I stumbled through the deep snow, trying to find any landmark I recognized, but it was useless. The last thing I remember was falling. The snow felt almost warm as I lay there, which I knew was a bad sign. Through my fading consciousness, I heard those heavy footsteps coming back. Something large and warm lifted me up, and everything went black. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Estes Park. A search and rescue team had found me at the edge of the woods, just a few hundred yards from the main trail. They said it was a miracle I was alive. The storm had been the worst in 20 years. But I didn't get away completely okay. The doctors couldn't save my feet. They'd been frozen too long in the snow. Sometimes I still feel them, like ghost feet that aren't really there. The official report said I got lost in the storm and got severe frostbite. Simple as that. But here's the strange part. When they found me, I was wrapped in something like a nest of branches and leaves, carefully built to keep me warm. And there were those symbols carved into the trees all around where they found me. Different ones this time, not warning marks, but something else. Almost like they were showing the rescue team where to look. The missing hikers? They started showing up too, one by one, at different spots along the park boundary. They were all alive, just confused and unable to remember much. Jim Peterson swears he remembers being carried through the snow by something big and warm, but everyone just thinks the cold messed with his head. I still work at the park, believe it or not. They gave me a desk job after I got my prosthetic feet. These days I help plan rescue operations and teach people about winter safety. But I never go into the backcountry anymore. Not because I'm scared, but because I understand now. Those mountains aren't just ours. Sometimes, on really quiet nights when the snow is falling, I hear those deep, rumbling sounds in the distance. And you know what? I sleep better knowing they're out there, watching over their part of the mountains. I never reported what I really saw that night, and I probably never will. Some secrets belong to the wilderness, but I did make one change to our park maps. There's a section deep in the backcountry that's now marked as environmentally sensitive area, no hiking permitted. If you look carefully at the trees along that boundary, you might still see some of those old symbols. And if you're smart, you'll do what they say. Turn around and go back the way you came. My name is Martin Cole, and I'm going to tell you about something that happened to me back in the summer of 1971. Something that still gives me nightmares. Something that cost me my right arm. I was 26 then, fresh out of college, and not really sure what to do with my life. When I saw the job posting for a fire lookout position in Glacier National Park, it seemed perfect. 3 months alone in a tower, watching for fires. Just me and the mountains. I thought it would give me time to figure things out. The park ranger who trained me, Bill Henderson, spent 2 days showing me how everything worked. The tower itself wasn't much, just a small room on stilts, sitting on top of a mountain. It had a bed, a small kitchen, and windows on all sides so I could watch the forest. There was also a radio to call for help if I spotted any fires. It gets lonely up here. Bill warned me on his last day. The isolation plays tricks on your mind sometimes. He paused before getting into his truck. If it gets too much, just radio in. No shame in that. I laughed it off. I'd always been good at being alone, and the view was incredible. From up there, I could see for miles. Endless green forests, snow-capped mountains, and the clearest sky I'd ever seen. During those first few weeks, I settled into a simple routine. Wake up at sunrise, check the forests with my binoculars, log any unusual smoke or weather, and repeat until sunset. But then things started to change. It began with shadows, huge ones, moving across the treetops on perfectly clear days. At first I told myself it was just clouds. But clouds don't move the way these shadows did. They didn't drift, they swooped. Then came the sounds at night. Not the usual forest noises I'd gotten used to, the howl of wolves or the cry of eagles. This was different. It was like thunder, but it came from somewhere much closer. And sometimes, mixed in with that sound, I heard something that reminded me of a bird's cry. Except, no bird I knew could make a sound that loud. I remember the exact day everything changed, June 15th. That was when I first saw it, and when I realized just how small and helpless we humans really are up in these mountains. Looking back now, I wish I'd paid more attention to the local legends, the stories the Native Americans told about the great thunderbirds. Maybe then I would have been better prepared for what was coming, but I guess some lessons you have to learn the hard way. That morning started like any other. I was sipping my coffee, doing my usual scan of the forest with my binoculars, when something caught my eye. About 2 miles away, the tops of the pine trees were swaying. Not just a few trees, a whole line of them, like something big was pushing through them. At first I thought it might be a sudden gust of wind, but there was no wind that day. The air was dead still, and the trees on either side weren't moving at all. Whatever was moving those trees was solid, and it was heading straight toward my tower. I grabbed my logbook and started writing everything down. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the pen. The thing, whatever it was moving fast, too fast for a bear or any animal I knew. Then it reached a clearing, and for the first time, I saw it. I dropped my binoculars. Rising above the tree line was the biggest bird I'd ever seen. Its feathers were dark blue-black, like storm clouds, and when it spread its wings, they seemed to stretch forever. Its head was the size of a car, with a sharp, hooked beak that could probably snap a person in half. But it was the eyes that got me, yellow-orange, like balls of fire, and they were looking right at my tower. I scrambled for the radio. "This is Fire Tower 7. Come in, base, come in." All I got back was static. I tried again and again, but nothing came through except the crackle of interference. The bird, if you could even call it that, circled the clearing once, then disappeared back into the clouds. I spent the rest of the day watching, waiting, jumping at every shadow. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind picked up, and with every gust I imagined those massive wings beating against the sky. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. There, stuck in one of the support beams of my tower, was a feather. It was as long as my arm and as thick as my wrist, blacker than anything I'd ever seen. When I touched it, it felt warm, like it was carrying its own heat. I knew I should leave. Any sane person would have packed up and hiked down the mountain right then. But something kept me there. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was just being stubborn. Whatever it was, I decided to stay. I needed proof of what I'd seen. No one would believe me otherwise. Looking back, that was probably the biggest mistake of my life, because over the next few days, the creature didn't just watch anymore. It started getting closer, and I began to realize that maybe it wasn't just curious about my tower. Maybe it was hungry. A week passed, and things got worse every day. The radio still wouldn't work. Just static and strange thunder-like sounds whenever I tried to use it. I started finding more feathers, some as big as baseball bats, scattered around the tower. But worst of all were the claw marks. One morning, I climbed down to check the tower supports and found deep scratches in the metal beams. They were as wide as my hand, and so deep I could fit my fingers in them. Something that powerful could tear the whole tower apart if it wanted to. I spent my days reading through all the papers and books in the tower. There wasn't much, but I found an old book about Native American legends. It talked about the thunderbird, a creature so big it could carry away whales from the ocean. The tribe said its wings made the sound of thunder, and lightning flashed from its eyes. I thought these were just stories. But now, every word felt true. The creature started visiting at night. I'd wake up to the whole tower shaking, the windows rattling like they might break. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of it in the moonlight. Just a massive shape blocking out the stars, circling my tower over and over. One night, it got really close. I was huddled in my sleeping bag, pretending to be asleep, when a shadow fell over me. It was bigger than my fist, and looking into it felt like staring into a campfire. The creature tilted its head, studying me like a hawk watches a mouse. I didn't move. I barely breathed. For what felt like hours, we just stared at each other. Then it tapped the glass with its beak, just once, gentle, like it was testing it. The whole window creaked. If it had hit any harder, the glass would have shattered. That's when I realized I wasn't just being watched anymore. I was being hunted. I tried to think like a park ranger. What do you do when a predator is stalking you? Make yourself look big? Make noise? But how do you scare off something that's bigger than your whole tower? The next day, I prepared for the worst. I gathered everything I could use as a weapon: my flashlight, my hiking axe, matches, and the emergency flares. I pushed my bed against the wall and stacked my supplies in the corner. If this thing wanted a fight, I'd give it one. But deep down, I knew none of it would be enough. Not against something that could block out the sun with its wings. As the sun set that evening, turning the sky blood red, I heard it coming, the beat of wings like rolling thunder. The cry that shook the mountains. The real battle was about to begin. It hit the tower just after midnight. The whole building shook so hard I thought it would collapse. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it out the window, catching sight of those massive wings as they passed by. The creature screamed, a sound that was part eagle cry, part thunder, and so loud it made my ears ring. Then it came again, slamming into the tower's side. Glass cracked. Metal groaned. I could hear the support beams starting to bend. The next hit would break through for sure. I had to do something fast. Looking around the room, my eyes landed on the emergency flares. Then I remembered what the book said about the Native Americans believing these creatures came from storm clouds. Maybe, just maybe, they were afraid of fire. I grabbed my matches and the flares with shaking hands. The creature hit the tower again, and this time the window shattered. Cold wind and rain whipped in, along with something else, a smell like ozone, like the air just before lightning strikes. A huge head pushed through the broken window. Up close, the thunderbird was even more terrifying. Its beak was lined with sharp ridges, like teeth. Those fire-colored eyes fixed on me, and I knew this was it. Either my plan would work, or I'd die right here. I struck the matches and lit all the flares at once. Red light filled the room. The creature pulled back a bit, surprised by the sudden brightness. That's when I started throwing things: my sleeping bag, my papers, my books, anything that would burn. I lit it all on fire. The flames spread fast. Smoke filled the room. The thunderbird screamed again, but this time it sounded angry. It thrust its head back through the window, beak snapping at me. I dove away, but I wasn't fast enough. Its beak caught my right arm, and the pain was worse than anything I'd ever felt. But somehow, that pain kept me thinking clear. With my left hand, I grabbed the last flare and threw it straight at one of those blazing eyes. The creature jerked back with a shriek that shook the whole mountain. Its wings beat frantically, trying to get away from the fire that was now consuming the tower. I was trapped between the flames and a 30-foot drop to the ground. My right arm was useless, bleeding badly. The smoke was getting thicker. I had to choose, burn or jump. I jumped. The last thing I remember is falling through the cold night air, seeing the tower above me glowing orange with fire, and watching a massive shadow disappear into the storm clouds above. Then everything went black. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Montana. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive. The fall had broken my leg and some ribs, but those would heal. My right arm, though, that was a different story. The damage was too bad. They had to take it off just below the shoulder. The official report said the fire started because of a lightning strike. They found the tower completely burned down, with weird burn patterns they couldn't explain. The metal support beams were bent and twisted in ways that didn't make sense, but nobody wanted to hear my story about a giant bird. They just nodded and wrote it off as trauma from my injuries. But I know what I saw, and I wasn't the only one. A week after I got out of the hospital, an old Native American man visited me. He said he was from one of the local tribes, and he believed my story. His people had stories about the Thunderbird going back hundreds of years. He told me I was lucky. Most people who met the Thunderbird never lived to tell about it. That was 50 years ago. I'm an old man now, but I still dream about that night. Sometimes, during big storms, I look up at the dark clouds and wonder if it's still out there. The doctors gave me a prosthetic arm, and whenever kids ask me what happened, I usually make up something simple. It's easier than telling the truth. But here's something I've never told anyone else. 2 weeks after I got home from the hospital, I found something on my front porch. It was one of those huge black feathers, still warm to the touch, like it had just fallen from the sky. I keep it locked in a box under my bed. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out just to make sure it was all real. I never went back to Glacier National Park. Never took another job in the mountains either. But whenever I hear thunder that doesn't sound quite right, or see a shadow pass over the sun that's too big to be a cloud, I remember that summer in the fire tower, and I wonder if the Thunderbird remembers me too. You might not believe my story. Most people don't. But next time you're out in the wilderness and hear thunder on a clear day, look up. Look up real quick. You might just see something that changes everything you thought you knew about our world. Just hope it doesn't see you back. My name is Patrick Delaney, and I shouldn't be alive to tell this story. What happened in the Everglades that summer of 1977 changed me forever. Some nights, when I hear water lapping against the dock or catch a strange smell on the wind, it all comes rushing back. I was a water patrol ranger back then, fresh out of training and eager to make a difference. The Everglades was my home. All those twisted waterways, the hanging moss, and the chorus of frogs at sunset. I loved every bit of it. My job was simple: cruise the waters in my patrol boat, help lost tourists, and make sure everyone followed the park rules. But everything changed when we found that first empty boat. It was a perfect June morning, the kind where the air feels like warm honey, and the water's so still it looks like glass. The radio crackled with a routine call. Someone reported an unmanned boat going in circles near Gator Creek. We got calls like this sometimes, usually just careless tourists who'd forgotten to tie their boat properly. But this was different. When I pulled up beside that little fishing boat, its engine was still humming away, creating ripples in the otherwise mirror-smooth water. 2 fishing poles were set up, lines still in the water. A half-drunk can of beer sat in the cup holder, still cold. The life jackets were all there. The keys were in the ignition. It was like the fisherman had just vanished into thin air. I had no idea then, but this was just the beginning. If I'd known what was lurking in those waters, what was watching us from the shadows of the mangroves, I would have quit right then and there. But I didn't know. None of us did. And that's why most of my fellow rangers aren't here anymore to tell their stories. That first empty boat was just the start. Over the next 2 weeks, we found 3 more, all running, all abandoned. Each time it was the same story. Everything left behind like the people had just disappeared into thin air. Coffee cups still warm, phones still playing music, fishing lines still in the water. My boss tried to explain it away. Maybe they fell overboard, he'd say. Maybe they're just pranks. But I knew better. The hairs on the back of my neck would stand up every time I went near those empty boats. Something wasn't right. Then the smell started. If you've ever been to the Everglades, you know it has its own scent: mud, plants, and warm water. But this was different. It was like rotten eggs mixed with wet dog, and it would come and go without warning. The other rangers noticed it too. One evening, while I was writing up my report about another empty boat, old Tom, our longest-serving ranger, came to my office. His hands were shaking as he held his coffee cup. "Delaney," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I saw something today. Something big." I stopped writing and looked up. Tom wasn't the type to scare easily. He'd handled gators, pythons, and angry poachers without breaking a sweat. "It was near Sawgrass Point," he continued. "At first, I thought it was a bear standing in the water. But bears don't stand 7 feet tall, and bears don't walk on 2 legs." Before I could ask more questions, the radio crackled to life. Another boat had been found, this time with scratch marks all along its side. Deep scratches, like something huge had tried to climb aboard. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard something moving outside my ranger cabin. Heavy footsteps in the mud. Then a sound I'll never forget. A low, rumbling growl that was nothing like a gator or a bear. I stayed perfectly still, hardly breathing, until the footsteps faded away. The next morning I found massive footprints outside my window. They were almost human-like, but way too big. And they led straight into the water. I knew then that we weren't dealing with ordinary animal attacks or accidents. Something was hunting in our waters. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. I couldn't sleep after seeing those footprints. I spent my free time at the local library, reading old newspapers and asking questions. The librarian, Mrs. Martinez, knew all the local stories. She told me about something the old-timers called the skunk ape, a tall, hairy creature that lived deep in the Everglades. I'd always thought it was just a story to scare kids. "Every few decades," she said, pushing her glasses up her nose, People start disappearing from their boats. Then the creature goes away, and everyone forgets until it happens again. I took my concerns to my boss, Captain Reynolds. He just laughed. "Delaney, you're letting ghost stories get to you," he said, shuffling papers on his desk. "We've got real work to do." But that same week, we lost our first ranger. Mike Collins went out on a night patrol and never came back. We found his boat the next morning, empty, engine running, just like all the others. Only this time, there was blood on the deck. The search party found nothing. No body, no clues, just that terrible smell hanging in the air. One by one, my fellow rangers asked for transfers. They could feel it too. Something watching us from the dark water, waiting. Then one misty morning, I saw it. I was checking some fishing permits when movement caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a dead tree trunk in the water. But tree trunks don't have eyes, and they don't move against the current. It was huge, with dark, matted fur and eyes that looked almost human. For a second, we just stared at each other. Then it sank below the surface, leaving barely a ripple. I called it in on my radio, but by the time backup arrived, there was nothing to see. Just that awful smell lingering in the air. That night, they called an emergency meeting. Out of our original team of 12 Rangers, only 5 of us were left. Captain Reynolds couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had to be done. "We'll patrol in pairs from now on," he ordered. But looking around that room, at the empty chairs where my friends used to sit, I knew it wouldn't be enough. Whatever this thing was, it was getting bolder. And I had a terrible feeling it wasn't finished with us yet. Patrolling in pairs didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. The creature was smarter than we thought. It would wait until boats got separated, even just by a few yards, then strike. We lost 2 more rangers in 1 week. First Jim, then Sarah. Both times their partners said the same thing. One minute the other boat was there, the next it was empty. Just empty boats drifting on dark water. And that horrible smell hanging in the air. Captain Reynolds broke down after Sarah disappeared. I found him in his office, staring at a map covered in red pins showing where we'd found all the empty boats. "I sent them out there," he kept saying. "I sent them to die." The next morning, he was gone too. Left his badge on his desk with a note that just said, "I'm sorry." That left just me and Rodriguez. We stuck together like glue, radioing each other every 5 minutes during our patrols. But one rainy afternoon, Rodriguez's radio went silent. I raced to his last known location, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. His boat was there, motor humming quietly in the rain. On the deck I found his radio, crushed like it was made of paper, and on the side of his boat were those same huge claw marks, still wet. I was alone now. The last ranger on water patrol. The Park Service wanted to send replacements, but I begged them to wait. I knew what I had to do. This thing, this skunk ape, it had a pattern. It attacked at night, always near the deeper channels. And now, with everyone else gone, I knew it would come for me next. So, I made a plan. A crazy plan that would probably get me killed. But I couldn't just sit and wait for more people to disappear. I had to end this. That evening, I loaded my boat with extra fuel, lights, and my hunting rifle. As the sun set and the shadows grew long across the water, I radioed in. Starting my night patrol, I said, knowing it might be my last call. Just routine checks. But this patrol would be anything but routine. I was going hunting, or maybe I was letting it hunt me. The moon was just a thin slice in the sky that night. I cut my engine near Gator Creek, letting my boat drift silently. The only sounds were the gentle splash of water and the distant cry of birds. I kept my rifle close, though deep down I knew bullets might not be enough. Then I smelled it. That awful rotten egg smell. My flashlight beam caught something moving in the water, just a ripple at first, then bigger waves. Something was circling my boat. I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the boat rocked violently. A huge, hairy arm, bigger than my whole body, reached over the side. The fingers were long, with black claws that dug into the metal like it was butter. The smell was overwhelming now. I fired my rifle. The sound exploded across the water. The creature roared, a sound so loud it shook the trees on the shore. But it didn't let go. The boat tipped dangerously as it pulled itself up. In the beam of my fallen flashlight, I saw its face. It was like a nightmare version of a human face, with deep-set eyes that glowed red in the dark. Thick, matted fur covered its massive body, dripping with swamp water. I fired again and again. The creature stumbled back, but now it was angry. Really angry. It slammed into the boat with such force that I was thrown into the water. The cold hit me like a punch. Under the surface, I could see its massive shape moving toward me, faster than anything that big should move. I kicked hard, swimming for my life. My lungs were bursting. Just when I thought I couldn't hold my breath any longer, my head broke the surface. The shore was close, maybe 30 feet away. But then something grabbed my leg. I was dragged under again. In the murky water, I found myself face to face with the creature. Its red eyes burned into mine. This was it. This was how I would die. But somehow, my hand found the emergency flare in my jacket pocket. With the last of my strength, I pulled the cord and shoved it straight into one of those glowing red eyes. The water around us lit up bright red. The creature's roar underwater was like a bomb going off. It let go of my leg, thrashing in pain. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I swam like I'd never swam before, not stopping until I hit the muddy shore. Behind me, I could hear it splashing and roaring, moving away into deeper water. I lay there in the mud, shaking, until dawn came. They found me there the next morning, still clutching the empty flare casing. That was my last night as a water patrol ranger. They found my boat the next morning, torn almost in half. Nobody believed my story about the creature. They blamed it all on a rogue alligator. But they couldn't explain the massive claw marks, or why the metal was bent like paper, or the strange red-tinted fur stuck to the edges of the boat. The nightmares started that same night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing red eyes staring at me through dark water. I tried to tell people what really happened, but the words wouldn't come out. Soon, I stopped trying to speak at all. That was 47 years ago. I still live near the Everglades, in a small house far from the water. Sometimes on quiet nights, I hear stories about empty boats found drifting in the channels. When that happens, I lock my doors and windows tight. I never went back on the water, never spoke another word. Some wounds don't heal, and some memories don't fade. But I'm writing this now because last week, I saw in the newspaper that they found another empty boat. Engine running, everything left behind, just like before. And I know it's starting again. So, Let this be a warning. If you're out on the waters of the Everglades and you catch a whiff of that rotten egg smell, or see something large moving just below the surface, don't wait. Don't try to be brave. Just get out of there as fast as you can, because the skunk ape is still out there, and it's still hungry. Patrick Delaney, July 15th, 2024. My name is Harold Matthews, and after 20 years as a climbing ranger at Grand Canyon National Park, I thought I'd seen everything. I was wrong, dead wrong. I remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it happened back in '83. The morning started like any other, the sun painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and red, the cool breeze carrying the smell of sage and dust. I was in my little office near the south rim, going through some paperwork, when my radio crackled to life. Base, this is Lookout Point. We've got another distress call. Over. I sighed and picked up the radio. We'd been getting a lot of strange calls lately. 3 hikers had gone missing in the past month, just vanished into thin air. No bodies, no gear, nothing. It wasn't normal. The canyon can be dangerous, sure, but experienced climbers don't just disappear. Copy that, Lookout. What's the situation? Over. 2 climbers stuck on the east face. They're saying something's up there with them. They sound really scared, Harold. I felt a chill run down my spine, despite the warm morning. Those missing climbers had said similar things before we lost contact with them, about seeing massive shadows, hearing wing beats that sounded like thunder. I grabbed my rescue gear, ropes, harnesses, first aid kit, all the usual stuff. But this time, something made me pack extra supplies. Call it a gut feeling, or maybe it was those stories my grandfather used to tell me about the ancient creatures that lived in these canyons, the ones the Native Americans called thunderbirds. I'm assembling a team, I told the radio operator. Tell those climbers to stay put and stay calm. We're coming. If I'd known what was waiting for us in those deep, twisted canyons, I might have called in the National Guard instead. But hindsight, as they say, is always perfect, and some things are just too big, too impossible to believe until you see them with your own eyes. Little did I know, this would be my last rescue mission. And what happened next would become a legend among the rangers of Grand Canyon, the ones who lived to tell about it anyway. I picked 2 of my best rangers for the rescue, Mike Rodriguez and Sarah Chen. We'd worked together for years, and I trusted them with my life. As we started our descent into the canyon, the morning sun disappeared behind thick clouds that seemed to come from nowhere. Those clouds don't look right, Sarah said, squinting up at the sky. Weather report didn't mention any storms today. She was right. The clouds were moving too fast, swirling in ways I'd never seen before. But we had to keep going. Somewhere down there, 2 climbers needed our help. We rappelled down the canyon wall, our ropes swaying in the growing wind. That's when we found the first sign something was wrong. A perfectly good climbing rope, sliced clean through, dangling from a rock outcrop. Harold, Mike called out, his voice shaking a little. You need to see this. He was pointing at the rock wall. There were marks there, huge scratches that looked like claw marks, deeper than any I'd seen before. They were fresh, too, the exposed rock still pale and dusty. Mountain lion? Sarah asked, but we all knew better. No mountain lion could make marks that big. That's when we heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Like thunder, but different, more alive, more hungry. And it was coming from directly above us. "Nobody move," I whispered. We were dangling there on our ropes, hundreds of feet up the canyon wall, completely exposed. A shadow passed over us, bigger than any birds should be. Much bigger. I slowly turned my head up, and for a moment, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. Against the dark clouds, something was circling, something with wings wider than a small plane, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for its size. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed. The radio at my belt crackled. Through the static, I could barely make out the words. "Stott, help. It's coming back, please." We were running out of time. Those climbers were still up there somewhere, and now we knew what had them trapped. The question was, what were we going to do about it? We had to move fast. I signaled to Mike and Sarah to follow me toward a deep crack in the canyon wall. Somewhere we could get out of the open. The wind was getting stronger, whipping our ropes around like crazy. The distress call came from up there. I pointed to a ledge about 50 feet above us. "We'll need to." That's when we heard the screaming. Not human screaming. This was different. It was like the sound of metal being torn apart, mixed with the loudest eagle cry you've ever heard. The whole canyon seemed to shake with it. "Look!" Sarah pointed up, her hand trembling. Through a gap in the clouds, we saw it clearly for the first time. The Thunderbird was huge, bigger than my truck, with feathers that looked like they were made of dark metal. Its beak was longer than my arm, curved and sharp like a giant hook. But it was the eyes that got me, bright yellow and smart. Too smart. The creature was diving straight for something on the ledge above us. That's when we spotted them, the two missing climbers, pressed against the canyon wall, trying to make themselves as small as possible. "We've got to do something," Mike said, already pulling out his rescue rope. But before we could move, the Thunderbird landed on the ledge. The whole rock face shook. One of the climbers panicked and tried to run. Bad move. The bird's head shot forward like a snake. "No," I shouted, but it was too late. The climber was gone, just like that. The second climber was frozen in fear. The Thunderbird turned its massive head looking right at us. Those yellow eyes seemed to stare straight into my soul. "Nobody move," I whispered. "Not a muscle." The bird took a step toward the edge, its claws leaving deep marks in the solid rock. Each step made a sound like thunder. Now I understood how it got its name. That's when I noticed something else. Behind where the Thunderbird had landed, in a deep cave on the ledge, I could see something glowing. Something that looked like eggs. Giant, shimmering eggs. "It's protecting its nest," I said softly. "That's why it's been attacking people who get too close." The Thunderbird spread its wings, blocking out what was left of the sunlight. I knew we had about 2 seconds to make a decision that would either save or end our lives. I just hoped I would choose right. In that split second, I made my decision. "Sarah, Mike, get to the cave on the right, the one below us, now." We started moving just as the Thunderbird launched itself from the ledge. The air boomed with each wing beat as it circled around for another attack. The remaining climber was still frozen above us. "Help, please," he called out weakly. My heart was pounding. I couldn't leave him up there. "You two get to safety," I told my team. "I'm going up." "Harold, don't," Sarah yelled. But I was already climbing. The Thunderbird screamed again, and I felt the sound in my bones. I climbed faster than I ever had before, my hands finding holds without thinking. 20 feet to go. 15. 10. That's when everything went wrong. The massive bird dove straight at me. I pressed myself against the rock wall as those huge talons missed me by inches. But the wind from its wings was so strong it ripped my rope right out of its anchor. I was falling. By some miracle, I managed to grab onto a small ledge. My shoulders felt like they were being torn apart, but I held on. The climber was right above me now. "Jump!" I yelled to him. "I'll catch you." He looked terrified, but he knew it was his only chance. The climber jumped just as I pulled myself up enough to brace against the wall. I caught his arm with my right hand, but the impact almost made me lose my grip. "Mike! Sarah! The rescue rope!" They were already on it. The rope came flying up, but I knew we had seconds at most. The Thunderbird's shadow was getting bigger again. "Grab the rope," I told the climber. "Quick!" He got hold of it just as the Thunderbird made its final attack. I looked into those ancient yellow eyes and knew what I had to do. "Pull him up," I yelled to my team. Then I let go of the ledge. The last thing I remember was falling through the air, the Thunderbird diving after me. I could hear Sarah screaming my name, but I smiled, knowing my team and the climber would make it. They say no one ever found my body. The canyon holds many secrets, and I became one of them. Sarah Chen is the one who tells this story now. It's been 40 years since that day, but she still works at the park. She says it's because someone needs to know the truth. The official report says Harold Matthews died in a climbing accident, she tells new rangers. But we know what really happened. The rescued climber made it out safely. He never went climbing again. Mike quit the ranger service a month later, said he couldn't look at the canyon the same way anymore. But here's the strange thing. After that day, no one else ever disappeared in that part of the canyon. The massive claw marks are still there on the rock wall, though most people think they're just weird erosion marks. Sometimes, on stormy days when thunder rolls through the canyon, Sarah swears she sees a huge shadow pass over the cliffs. And on really quiet nights, rangers say they can hear something that sounds like giant wings beating against the air. They found my ranger badge 2 weeks after I disappeared. It was on a high ledge near that cave, placed carefully on a flat rock. Not thrown, not dropped, placed. Next to it was a single feather, bigger than any bird feather anyone had ever seen. Sarah keeps it locked in her desk drawer, but she won't show it to anyone. The old Native American stories say thunderbirds are protectors of the land. Maybe they were right. Maybe it wasn't just protecting its nest that day. Maybe it was protecting its home from too many people getting too close. These days, that part of the canyon is closed off. They say it's to protect some rare plants. But the older rangers know better. They make sure no one goes climbing there anymore. After all, some secrets of the canyon are better left alone. And sometimes, the best thing a ranger can do is make sure those secrets stay secret. That's what I did. That's why I made my choice. And you know what? I'd do it again. My name is Walter Reed, and I've been a search and rescue ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for 15 years. I've seen just about everything these mountains can throw at a person. Or so I thought, until that night in 1987. The night that changed everything. I still remember sitting at my desk, finishing up some paperwork when the call came in. 3 kids, Amy and Mark Johnson, ages 12 and 10, and their cousin Tommy Parker, 11, hadn't come back from their afternoon hike. Their parents had been setting up camp at Deep Creek Campground when the children asked to explore a nearby trail. That was 4 hours ago. Now the sun was setting, and temperatures were dropping fast. They were supposed to be back before dark, Mrs. Johnson told me over the phone, her voice shaking. They promised they wouldn't go far. Something's wrong, I just know it. I grabbed my gear, flashlight, first aid kit, radio, and warm clothes. I knew these mountains like the back of my hand, but they could turn deadly at night. Even in summer, temperatures could drop low enough to cause hypothermia, especially for kids who weren't prepared for a night outdoors. What made things worse was where they'd gone missing. The parents pointed me toward an old trail that hadn't been maintained in years. We called it Ghost Creek Trail, partly because of how the wind whistled through the trees there, and partly because hardly anyone used it anymore. Strange sounds had been reported in that area over the years, sounds that didn't match any known animal in the park. But I didn't believe in ghost stories. Not then, anyway. As I headed up the trail with my flashlight beam cutting through the growing darkness, I had no idea I was about to face something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Something that would test everything I thought I knew about these mountains, and about what was real and what wasn't. The wind picked up, rustling through the leaves above me, and somewhere in the distance I heard a sound that made me stop in my tracks. It wasn't quite a howl and it wasn't quite a scream. It was something in between. Something I'd never heard before in all my years in these mountains. And it was coming from the direction those kids had gone. I clicked my radio. Base, this is Reed. I'm about a mile up Ghost Creek Trail. No sign of the kids yet, but I've found some footprints. I crouched down, shining my flashlight on the muddy ground. 3 sets of small sneaker prints headed deeper into the woods. At least I knew I was on the right track. The old trail was getting harder to follow. Tree branches hung low, scratching at my face. Thick, moss-covered fallen logs that the kids would have had to climb over. My flashlight beam caught something colorful stuck to one of the branches, a piece of blue fabric that looked like it came from a child's jacket. That's when I heard it again. That strange sound. Closer this time. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. In all my years of rescue work, I'd heard bears, mountain lions, and wolves. This was different. It sounded almost human. "Hello?" I called out. "Amy? Mark? Tommy?" Only the wind answered, whistling through the trees. But then I heard something else, crying. Soft, frightened crying coming from somewhere ahead. I picked up my pace, careful not to trip on the uneven ground. The beam of my flashlight bounced off the trees, creating weird shadows that seemed to move. The crying got louder. It had to be one of the kids. Then I saw something that made me freeze. In a patch of mud ahead were more footprints. But these weren't from kids' sneakers. They were huge, twice the size of my boots, and shaped like bare feet. Whatever made them was walking on 2 legs. My heart started pounding. I'd heard stories from old-timers about giant footprints in these mountains. I'd always laughed them off, but now, staring at those prints, I wasn't laughing anymore. The crying had stopped. The forest went completely quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just that heavy silence that comes when something big is nearby. Something that doesn't want to be seen. I gripped my flashlight tighter and took a deep breath. Those kids were out there, scared and alone. Whatever else was in these woods, my job was to find them and bring them home safe. But as I started walking again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness. Something that didn't want me here. Something that was getting closer with every step I took. I kept moving forward, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. That's when I heard twigs snapping behind me, heavy footsteps that weren't trying to be quiet. I spun around, but saw nothing except shadows between the trees. "This is Ranger Reed," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "If anyone's there, I'm here to help." A low grunt came from my left, then another from my right. They were moving around me, whatever they were. The smell hit me next, like wet dog and something else I couldn't place. Something wild. "Amy? Mark? Tommy?" I called again, louder this time. Finally, I got an answer. "Help! We're up here." It was a girl's voice. Had to be Amy. It came from up ahead, maybe 50 yards away, but something was wrong. She sounded terrified. I moved faster now, my boots slipping on wet leaves. The voices and movement around me got closer. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of something big moving in the darkness. Not just one something, several of them. My flashlight beam caught movement ahead. For just a second I saw it, a massive shape, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur. It disappeared behind a tree so fast I almost thought I'd imagined it. Almost. "Please help us!" This time it was a boy's voice. "They won't let us leave." I rounded a bend in the trail and my flashlight beam found them. All 3 kids were huddled in a shallow cave made by 2 fallen trees. They were dirty and scratched up, but alive. Amy had her arms around the 2 younger boys. But they weren't alone. Standing between me and the cave was the biggest creature I'd ever seen. In the flashlight beam, I could see it clearly now. It looked like something between a man and an ape, with long arms and legs covered in thick, dark fur. Its face was almost human, but not quite, and its eyes, they glowed red in my flashlight beam. 2 more creatures emerged from the trees behind it. A smaller one, maybe female, and what looked like a younger one. A family. They were protecting the kids, I realized. Not hurting them, but not letting them leave either. The big male took a step toward me and let out a roar that shook the leaves on the trees. I had to make a choice, and fast. Those kids needed to get out of here, but one wrong move, and this could turn ugly real quick. I'd never been more scared in my life. But I couldn't let these children down. I just had to figure out how to get past 3 angry Sasquatch without getting us all killed. I knew I had to stay calm. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to lower my flashlight so it wasn't shining directly in the creature's eyes. The big male was watching my every move, its breath coming out in clouds in the cold night air. "It's okay," I said softly, talking to both the kids and the creatures. "Nobody needs to get hurt here." I took one slow step forward. The male Sasquatch growled, showing teeth that could probably tear me apart. The female pulled the younger one closer, just like Amy was doing with the boys in the cave. That's when I had an idea. Moving very slowly, I reached into my pack and pulled out the sandwich I'd brought for dinner. I unwrapped it and tossed it gently toward them. The young Sasquatch sniffed the air curiously. "Kids," I said quietly, "when I give the signal, I want you to run to me. Run as fast as you can. Understand?" I saw 3 small heads nod in the darkness. I pulled out my emergency flare. The creatures watched, curious but tense. "Get ready," I whispered to the kids. In one quick motion, I struck the flare. Bright red light exploded in the darkness. The creatures roared and stumbled back, shielding their eyes. Their shadows looked enormous on the trees behind them. "Now!" I yelled. The kids bolted from the cave. Amy and Mark ran past the creatures, but Tommy tripped on a root. The male Sasquatch reached for him with those massive hands. I didn't think. I just acted. I ran forward and grabbed Tommy, pushing him toward the others. But as I turned to run, I felt something huge slam into my back. Pain shot through my right leg as I hit the ground. The male had me. I could feel its hot breath on my neck. The kids were screaming. "Run!" I shouted at them. "Follow the trail back. Don't stop." I heard their footsteps fading away as I fought to break free. The creature's grip was like iron. I could feel bones cracking in my leg. The pain was worse than anything I'd ever felt. But the kids were getting away. That's all that mattered. The last thing I remember was the female making a sound, almost like she was calling the male off. The pressure on my leg eased, but the damage was done. As I lay there in the dirt, my flashlight showed 3 huge shapes disappearing into the forest, melting away like they'd never been there at all. I don't remember much about getting out of those woods. The pain in my leg was too much, and I kept passing out. But I do remember the rescue team finding me, and the kids' voices telling them where I was. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. My right leg was crushed pretty badly. Even after 6 surgeries, I never walked right again. These days, I need a cane to get around. But when people ask what happened, I just tell them I had an accident in the mountains. Who would believe the truth? The kids made it back safely. That's what matters most. They were scared but not hurt. When the rangers asked them what happened, they told different stories. Amy said big monkeys had kept them safe from the cold. Mark said they were held captive by giants. Tommy wouldn't say anything at all. Their parents wanted to report what happened to the newspapers, but I convinced them not to. "Let's just be thankful they're safe," I told them. They agreed, probably because they knew no one would believe them anyway. I still work at the park, but now I stay in the office, helping coordinate rescues instead of going on them. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I can hear those sounds again, those not quite human calls echoing down from the mountains. The other rangers have noticed that no one ever goes missing on Ghost Creek Trail anymore. It's like something up there is keeping people away, something that doesn't want to be found. I've never told this story before now. Some nights, when my leg is aching and I can't sleep, I wonder if it really happened the way I remember it. But then I look at the old photos from that night. The plaster casts the rangers made of those huge footprints, the strange clumps of dark fur they found near the cave, and I know it was real. Those creatures could have killed me. Instead, they let me live. Maybe they understood I was just trying to help, just like they had been trying to help those kids in their own way. Or maybe they just didn't want any more trouble. Either way, I learned something that night. These mountains hold secrets bigger than any of us imagine. And sometimes, the line between legend and reality isn't as clear as we think. But if you're ever hiking in the Great Smoky Mountains, and you hear something strange in the distance, something that sounds almost human, but not quite, do yourself a favor. Turn around and go back. My name is Frank Hudson, and I've been a ranger at Mount Rainier National Park for 15 years. What happened last winter changed my life forever. I'm writing this down because people need to know the truth about what's really up there in those mountains. It all started during the worst storm I'd ever seen. The weather forecast had warned us about a big blizzard coming, but nobody expected anything like this. The wind howled like an angry beast, and the snow was falling so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. I was in my cabin near Paradise Lodge when I got the first call. Jim, one of our park guides, was worried about some strange noises he'd heard while checking on the hiking trails. "Frank, I've been up here for 20 years, he said, his voice shaking. "I've never heard anything like this. It's not a wolf, not a bear. It's something else." I told him to head back to the lodge, but something in his voice bothered me. Jim wasn't the type to get spooked easily. That same morning, I'd found something odd. Fresh tire tracks leading to an old restricted area. Someone had been driving heavy trucks up there, probably doing some illegal mining. We'd had trouble with that before, people trying to dig up the mountain's resources without permission. But in this weather, they must have been crazy. The storm got worse as night fell. The temperature dropped to -30, and the wind got so strong it shook my whole cabin. That's when I heard it too, a sound that made my blood freeze. It was like a scream and a roar mixed together, echoing off the mountains. It sounded hungry. I grabbed my emergency gear and radio, knowing something was very wrong. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of the most terrifying experience of my life. Looking back now, I wish I'd never answered that call. I wish I'd stayed in my warm cabin that night. But when you're a ranger, saving people is just what you do, even if it means facing something that shouldn't exist. That night, 3 hikers went missing. They were staying at Paradise Lodge, and like idiots, they'd gone out to experience the storm. Now we had to find them before they froze to death. I called together a search team. There was me, Jim, and 2 other rangers named Sarah and Mike. The wind was so strong we had to rope ourselves together. Our flashlights barely helped. The snow was like a white wall in front of us. "Look!" Sarah pointed to something dark in the snow. It was a backpack, ripped to shreds. Next to it were footprints, but they looked wrong. Too big, too deep. And there was something else that made my stomach turn. Drops of red in the snow. That's when Jim's radio crackled to life. Through the static, we heard one of the missing hikers screaming, "Please, someone. It's following us. We're near the old mine entrance." Oh God, I can hear it coming. The radio went dead. We followed their tracks to the abandoned mine shaft. None of us wanted to go in, but we had to save those hikers. Our flashlight beams showed that the old "Keep Out" sign had been torn down. Fresh tracks from heavy trucks led inside, along with drag marks in the dirt. Just then, we heard that sound again, that awful screaming roar. But this time it was closer, much closer. It echoed from deep inside the mine shaft. Mike grabbed my arm. "Frank, I've worked these mountains for 10 years. Whatever made that sound, it's not natural." I swallowed hard and checked my rifle. Natural or not, we've got people to save. The mine entrance was like a black mouth in the mountain. As we stepped inside, the howling of the storm grew quiet. But somehow, that silence was even worse. Every drip of water, every crunch of our boots seemed too loud. None of us knew it then, but we were walking straight into a nightmare. And that mine shaft, it wasn't just a mine anymore. It was something's lair. The mine tunnel went deep into the mountain. Our flashlights showed old mining equipment scattered everywhere, picks, shovels, and broken machines. But there was new stuff too. Someone had brought in modern drilling gear, and they'd dug much deeper than they should have. "Frank," Sarah whispered, pointing to the wall. "Look at these claw marks." She was right. The rock walls were scratched with deep grooves, like something huge had been dragging its claws through solid stone. My hands started shaking, but I tried to stay calm for the team. That's when we found the first body. It was one of the miners, frozen solid. His face was frozen in a look of pure terror, and next to him was a piece of paper. It was his last note, written in shaky handwriting. "We dug too deep. We woke it up. The old stories were true. The Wendigo is real." Mike picked up a torn jacket nearby. "This belongs to one of our missing hikers," he said quietly. Suddenly, our flashlight beams caught movement ahead. Someone was stumbling toward us. It was one of the hikers. He looked half frozen and completely terrified. "Run," he screamed. "It's coming. It's so hungry, so hungry." Before we could reach him, we heard that horrible scream again. This time, it was right behind him. In our flashlight beams, we saw something tall and thin step out of the darkness. It looked almost human, but wrong, too tall, too skinny, with antlers growing from its head and claws as long as my arm. The hiker ran toward us, but he tripped. We all started shooting at the creature, but our bullets didn't seem to hurt it. It moved so fast. In a blur, it had grabbed the hiker and disappeared back into the darkness. "The cave chamber," Jim shouted. "This way." We ran into a large cave room off the main tunnel. Jim said we could defend ourselves better here. But as soon as we got inside, we realized our mistake. We heard a crash behind us. Rocks were falling, blocking the entrance. We were trapped. And in the darkness beyond our flashlight beams, we could hear it moving, circling us, getting closer. Our flashlights were getting dimmer. We huddled together in the cave, backs against each other, watching the darkness around us. The cave was huge. Our lights couldn't reach the walls or ceiling. Every few seconds, we'd hear claws scraping on rock, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We have to get out of here," Sarah whispered. Her voice was shaking. "Our lights won't last much longer." Jim was trying to move some of the fallen rocks, blocking our exit, but it was no use. They were too heavy. Mike kept his rifle pointed at the darkness, but we all knew bullets wouldn't help us now. That's when the temperature dropped even more. Our breath came out in thick white clouds, and frost started forming on our clothes. The creature, the Wendigo, was getting closer. We saw its eyes first, glowing like yellow fire in the dark. Then it stepped into our flashlight beams. It was even more horrible up close. Its skin was pulled tight over its bones, like it was starving. But its mouth was full of sharp teeth, and they were stained red. "Remember the old stories," Jim said suddenly. "Wendigos were once human. They turned into monsters because of greed and hunger." The creature tilted its head, like it understood us. For a moment, it almost looked sad. Then it let out that awful scream again and lunged at us. Everything happened so fast after that. Mike pushed me out of the way and fired his last bullets. Sarah threw her flashlight at it, and Jim swung his climbing axe. I fell and hit my head on the rocks. The last thing I remember was hearing my friends screaming, not from fear, but from hunger. The Wendigo hadn't killed them. It had done something much worse. It had made them like itself. I must have passed out, because the next thing I knew, I was alone in the dark. My friends were gone, but I could hear them moving in the darkness, and they didn't sound human anymore. I knew then that I wasn't getting out of this cave alive. At least, not as myself. They found me 3 weeks later. A rescue team spotted me stumbling through the snow, half frozen and barely alive. The doctors said I had eaten things to survive. I don't remember much about those weeks in the cave. Maybe that's for the best. The official report says my team got lost in the storm. They say the illegal miners probably fell down a shaft or got buried in a cave-in. They found the mining equipment, but no bodies. Not even pieces of them. But I know the truth. Sometimes at night, when the wind blows just right, I can hear them up there on the mountain. Their screams don't sound human anymore. And they're always hungry, so hungry. Nobody goes near that part of Mount Rainier now. The Park Service blocked off the mine entrance with concrete and posted warning signs everywhere. They say it's because the tunnels are unstable, but I know better. I quit my job as a ranger after that. I couldn't stay there, knowing what was up in those mountains. Some nights I wake up shaking, thinking I can hear scraping at my window. And when I look in the mirror, sometimes I think my teeth look a little sharper, my face a little thinner. The hunger is getting worse. I'm writing this down as a warning. If you're ever hiking on Mount Rainier and you hear strange screams in the wind, don't go looking for them. If you see abnormally large footprints in the snow, turn back immediately. And if you ever feel a hunger that nothing can satisfy, run. Run as fast as you can. Because they're still up there, my old friends, and they're always looking for someone new to join their endless feast. This will be my last note. The hunger is too strong now. I'm going back to the mountain, back to them, back home. If you're reading this, stay away from Mount Rainier during the storms. Some things should stay buried in the dark. Frank Hudson, Paradise Lodge Incident Report, February 15th, 1990. My name is Calvin Murphy, and I've been a radio dispatch ranger at Olympic National Park for 12 years now. Most people think my job is boring, just sitting in a cozy office all day, answering calls from hikers who've lost their way or need weather updates. What happened then? It changed everything I thought I knew about these woods. Let me take you back to December 1995. The park was quiet, like it always is in winter. Snow had blanketed our corner of Washington state, turning the massive evergreens into white giants. My dispatch office sat at the edge of the park, just a small room with windows looking out at endless forest. I had my usual setup: 3 radio units, a stack of maps, and enough coffee to keep me going through the long nights. That winter was especially cold, the kind of cold that makes the trees crack and pop in the darkness. I worked the night shift from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., keeping an ear out for any emergencies. We had a team of 5 rangers who patrolled different sections of the park, checking on the few brave campers who visited during winter and making sure no one got into trouble. I still remember the night it all started. The radio crackled to life around 10 p.m., nothing unusual there. But the voice that came through, something about it, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Help? Anyone there? We're lost. The voice sounded scared, young maybe. Please, if anyone can hear us. I did what I always do, asked for their location, any landmarks they could see. But the answer I got back was just static, then silence. I tried reaching our patrol rangers, but the weird thing was, none of them had picked up any sign of lost hikers in their areas. That was just the beginning. I didn't know it then, but that single call would lead to the most terrifying week of my life. Over the next few nights, more calls started coming in. Each one was different, but something felt off about them. One night, it was a woman crying about her lost dog. Another time, it was kids saying they'd wandered too far from their campsite. The thing is, when I checked our visitor logs, there weren't any matches for these people. I started keeping a notebook, writing down every strange call. The voices always came from areas where we rarely got any reception, the deepest, darkest parts of the park. My team of rangers took turns checking these spots, but they never found anyone. Then Tom, one of our best rangers, went missing. He'd radioed in to say he was checking out another distress call, this time from the old valley near Shadow Creek. "I see some tracks in the snow," he'd said. "They look weird though, Cal. Too big for a person, but not quite right for any animal I know." That was the last time I heard his voice. His real voice, anyway. 2 hours later, when he didn't check in, I sent Maria and Steve to look for him. They found his truck parked at the trailhead, engine cold. His flashlight was still in the cup holder. But no Tom. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about those tracks he mentioned. So I did something I'd never done before. I started digging through the park's old records. What I found made my blood run cold. Back in the 1800s, before this was a national park, settlers wrote about huge wolves in these woods. Not regular wolves. These were different. They were bigger, smarter, and worst of all, they could make sounds like human voices. The settlers called them dire wolves. Everyone thought they'd died out long ago, but what if they hadn't? I was staring at these old reports when my radio crackled again. This time I heard Tom's voice. "Cal, buddy, I need help. I'm hurt pretty bad." But something was wrong with how he spoke, like someone trying to copy his voice but not getting it quite right. That's when I realized what we were really dealing with. And that's when I knew my other rangers were in serious danger. I tried calling all my rangers back to the station right away. Maria and Steve were closest. They'd been searching for Tom. But before I could warn them, Maria's radio buzzed. "Steve, where are you?" she asked. "I heard you calling from behind those trees, but I can't see you." My hands shook as I grabbed my radio. "Maria, get out of there now. That's not Steve." But it was too late. I heard her scream, then nothing but static. I sat there in my dispatch office, feeling more alone than ever. The windows that usually helped me keep an eye on the park now felt like dark mirrors, reflecting my scared face back at me. Every shadow outside looked like it might be moving. The radio stayed quiet for what felt like forever. Then it started again. This time, I heard all their voices, Tom, Maria, and Steve, calling out one after another. They all wanted help. They all sounded hurt, but I knew it wasn't really them anymore. I tried calling the other parks for backup, but the storm that had been building all week finally hit. The phone lines were down, and the radio could barely reach anyone through the snow static. I was on my own. That's when I noticed something in the falling snow outside my window. Tracks. Big ones, like Tom had described. They circled my little dispatch office, getting closer with each loop. And then I heard it, scratching at the door. And voices. So many voices. All calling my name. "Cal, please let us in. It's so cold out here. Calvin, buddy, we need your help. Mr. Murphy, please." Each voice sounded almost right, but not quite, like when you hear someone you know talking in their sleep. And now I understood. Just like their ancestors had done with those settlers long ago, these dire wolves had learned our voices, learned our words. They'd been practicing, getting better at it, and they'd been hunting us one by one. I knew I couldn't stay in the dispatch office much longer. The scratching got louder, and I could hear heavy bodies bumping against the walls. The voices kept calling, but now they were mixing together, like a broken radio switching between channels. Sometimes they didn't even sound human anymore, just twisted howls trying to be words. My only chance was to make it to my truck. The keys felt heavy in my pocket as I grabbed my flashlight and emergency pack. The backup generator had kicked in when the power went out, but its hum was dying down. Soon I'd be in total darkness. Taking a deep breath, I counted the voices I could hear. At least 5 of them out there, maybe more. They were smart enough to split up, surrounding the building, one at each door, and probably watching the windows too. Then my radio crackled one last time. It was Tom's voice again, but this time it sounded different, more like a growl trying to be words. "Coming in now, Cal." The window behind me shattered. I spun around and my flashlight beam caught something I'll never forget. A massive wolf, bigger than any I'd ever seen, with eyes that glowed like yellow flames. But worse than that was its mouth, twisted into something almost like a smile, as it tried to shape words with teeth that were made for tearing. I didn't think, I just ran. Knocked over my desk to block the window and sprinted for the side door. The moment I opened it, cold air hit my face along with a chorus of howls. Real ones this time, not pretend human voices anymore. They'd given up trying to trick me. Through the swirling snow, I could see them. Dark shapes moving like shadows, bigger than bears, with those same glowing eyes. They weren't even trying to hide anymore. This was their victory howl. They thought they had me trapped, just like the others. I had one chance. My truck was only 30 feet away. The snow was falling so hard now I could barely see it, but I knew these wolves could smell me, could hear my heart pounding. I did the only thing I could think of. I threw my flashlight as far as I could in the opposite direction. The beam spun through the air, making crazy shadows dance across the snow. Some of the wolves turned to look, and that's when I ran. I've never run so fast in my life. The snow crunched under my feet, and I heard them coming after me, their huge paws pounding the ground. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped my keys, but somehow I got the truck door open and jumped inside. A massive weight slammed against the driver's side door just as I locked it. Yellow eyes stared at me through the window, and a mouth full of teeth snapped inches from my face. The engine roared to life on the first try. Thank God I'd checked it that morning. But the wolves weren't giving up. They surrounded my truck, pushing against it, trying to tip it over. One jumped onto the hood, its claws scratching the metal. It looked right at me and spoke in Maria's voice one last time. "Stay with us, Cal." I threw the truck into reverse and hit the gas. The wolf on my hood lost its balance and fell. I spun the wheel hard, turning toward the park exit. The wolves chased me all the way to the main road, their howls mixing with stolen human voices. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. When I finally pulled over, my hands were still shaking. I called in every ranger station, every police department, and every wildlife service I could think of. Search parties went out the next day. All they discovered were some strange tracks in the snow, already starting to melt away. I quit my job after that. Couldn't stand to look at those woods anymore, knowing what was hiding in them. Sometimes at night, I still hear those voices on the wind, not quite human, not quite wolf. And when my phone rings late at night, I let it go to voicemail. Because you never know who or what might be calling. My name is George Peterson, and I used to be a lake patrol ranger at Voyageurs National Park in Minnesota. I say used to be because after what happened in the summer of 1993, I never went back to working on the water. People ask me why I quit the best job I ever had, but I usually just shake my head and change the subject. Today, though, I'm finally going to tell you my story. I loved working at Voyageurs. It's a beautiful place where the water stretches as far as you can see, with thousands of little islands dotting the lakes like green jewels on blue glass. My job was simple. I drove my patrol boat around the park, helped lost tourists, checked fishing permits, and made sure everyone was safe on the water. Most days were peaceful, just me and the gentle splash of waves against my boat. That spring started like any other. The ice melted, the birds came back, and tourists began arriving in their boats and canoes. My team and I were busy getting ready for the summer season. We had 3 boats that would go out every day, me in one, Sarah Martinez in another, and Tom Bradley in the third. We'd been working together for years and knew these waters like the backs of our hands. But then the strange reports started coming in. It began with the Williams family, who were camping on one of the smaller islands. They woke up one morning to find their boat completely flipped over, even though it had been securely tied to the dock. The strange thing was, nothing was stolen, and there were no signs of a storm. I remember thinking it was just a fluke. Maybe they hadn't tied the boat properly, or maybe some drunk teenagers had played a prank. But then it happened again. And again, always at night, always the same way. Boats that were perfectly fine in the evening would be found capsized in the morning. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would change my life forever. People started getting scared. Within 2 weeks, we had 12 boats flipped over, and some campers even said they heard strange noises at night, like something big moving through the water, but different from the usual sounds of waves or animals. My boss called an emergency meeting. "Peterson," he said, looking worried, "I need you to patrol at night. Take extra flashlights and a radio. Find out what's going on before the tourists stop coming." That first night on patrol was eerily quiet. The moon was almost full, making silver paths on the dark water. I kept my boat at a slow speed, listening hard and watching the shadows between the islands. Around midnight, I heard something that made my skin crawl, a deep splashing sound, like something massive moving underwater. But when I turned my spotlight toward it, there was nothing there. Sarah radioed me around 2 a.m. Her voice was shaky. "George, you need to see this." I found her near Eagle Island, staring at something on the rocky shore. When I got closer, my heart nearly stopped. There were marks on the rocks, huge, claw-like scrapes that no bear or wolf could have made. We started finding more evidence. Bent metal cleats on the docks where boats had been tied, strange tracks in the mud near the shoreline, and fish nets torn to shreds. But the weirdest thing was when old Joe, who'd been fishing these waters for 50 years, came to my office looking pale as a ghost. "I know what it is," he whispered, his hands shaking as he held his coffee cup. "It's the same thing they saw down in Lake Worth, Texas, back in the 60s. That monster didn't die like they thought. It just moved north, following the rivers up here where there's more space to hide." I didn't want to believe him. Monsters aren't real, that's what I kept telling myself. But after what I saw next, I couldn't deny something horrible was lurking in our waters. That night, the radio crackled with Tom's panicked voice. "Something's circling my boat. It's big, really big. I can see, oh God, I can see its back breaking the surface. I need help. I need. Then, static. Just static. When Sarah and I found Tom's boat 20 minutes later, it was upright. But Tom was huddled in the corner, soaking wet and shivering. He pointed at 3 massive dents in the hull, perfectly spaced like giant fingers had tried to grab the boat from below. "We need to close the park," I said, but it was too late. Way too late. The park stayed open, but we set up new rules. No camping on the smaller islands. All boats had to be back before dark, and no one could go out alone. My team and I spent our days gathering information, trying to figure out what we were dealing with. I started talking to the locals, especially the older folks who'd lived here all their lives. They told me stories about something that had lived in these waters for generations, something that usually stayed in the deepest parts of the lakes. Mrs. Running Bear, whose grandfather had been a tribal elder, showed me an old drawing of a creature with a long neck and huge claws. "It usually sleeps," she said quietly, "but when it wakes up, it's hungry." One evening, while checking our underwater cameras, which kept getting broken, we found something that made us all go quiet. A massive scale, dark green and hard as a turtle shell, but bigger than my hand. The lab guys said they'd never seen anything like it. Then came the night that changed everything. Sarah, Tom, and I were out on a special patrol. We'd spotted something huge on our depth finder, bigger than any fish that should be in these waters. We followed the signal to Rocky Island, one of the smaller ones full of caves and steep cliffs. The sun was setting when our boat's engines died at the same time. Just died. Like something had pulled their plugs underwater. We drifted toward the island's rocky shore, using paddles to guide ourselves to a small dock. "We'll radio for help," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. But our radios weren't working either, just static and strange, low sounds that might have been water moving or something breathing. That's when we heard it, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The water around the island began to move in a way that had nothing to do with the wind or current. Tom grabbed my arm and pointed. About 50 yards out, something broke the surface. At first I thought it was a log, but logs don't move like that, and logs don't have eyes that glow yellow in the darkness. We were trapped on Rocky Island, and the thing we'd been hunting was now hunting us. "Get to higher ground," I whispered. "Now." As we ran up the rocky path, I heard a splash behind us that sounded like a car hitting the water. Something was coming ashore. We ran up to the highest point of the island, where an old fire tower stood. The metal stairs clanged under our feet as we climbed. From up there we could see all around the island, and that's when I finally saw the whole creature in the moonlight. It was like something from a nightmare. Picture the biggest alligator you've ever seen, then make it 3 times bigger. But this was no alligator. Its neck was long and snake-like, and instead of normal legs, it had these huge flipper legs with claws that could easily flip a boat. Its skin looked like wet stone, dark and bumpy, and those yellow eyes seemed to glow from within. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her hands gripping the railing. "Our backup won't come until morning when we don't check in." The creature was circling the base of the tower now, moving in a way that was almost graceful for something so big. Every few steps, it would rear up and look at us, water dripping from its jaws. I could smell its breath, like dead fish and seaweed. Tom started digging through his patrol bag. "I've got emergency flares," he said. "Maybe we can signal for help." But before he could get them out, The tower shuddered. The creature had reared up on its back legs and slammed against one of the support beams. The whole structure swayed like a tree in the wind. "It's trying to knock us down," I said, my mouth dry with fear. And these old towers weren't built to take this kind of beating. Wham! It hit the tower again. This time, I heard metal groaning. We had minutes, maybe less, before the whole thing came down. I looked at my team, then at my patrol bag, and I knew what I had to do. Sometimes being a leader means making the scariest choice of your life. When I say run, I told them, pulling out my flashlight and emergency radio, "You run straight for the dock. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just run and try to get the boat started." Sarah grabbed my arm. "What are you going to do?" I took a deep breath. "I'm going to give it something else to chase." The tower shuddered again. We were running out of time. The creature looked up at us, its yellow eyes glowing brighter than ever, and opened its mouth to let out a roar that shook the whole island. "Now!" I shouted, turning on my flashlight to its brightest setting. I threw my radio as hard as I could, and it hit the water with a splash. The creature's head whipped toward the sound. Sarah and Tom ran down the stairs while I waved my flashlight, yelling at the top of my lungs, "Hey! Over here! Come and get me!" The monster turned its attention back to me, those yellow eyes focusing on the bright light. That's when I learned something important. It really didn't like bright lights shined in its eyes. It reared back, shaking its head like it was hurt. I kept the beam right on its face and started moving around the tower platform, keeping it distracted while I heard my friends' footsteps getting fainter as they ran toward the dock. But then the creature did something I didn't expect. It dove back into the water, disappearing completely. The whole island went quiet. I ran down the tower stairs, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I was halfway to the dock when I heard it, a massive splash behind me. The creature had circled the island and was now between me and the boats. I could see Sarah and Tom in one of the boats, frantically trying to start the engine. The monster was getting ready to lunge at them. Without thinking, I grabbed a rock and threw it as hard as I could at the creature's head. "Leave them alone." It worked, maybe too well. The monster turned toward me, and I saw its muscles bunch up, getting ready to spring. That's when I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a boat engine roaring to life. Tom had gotten it started. The creature's head snapped toward the noise, giving me just enough time to run past it. "Jump!" Sarah screamed, reaching out her hand as they brought the boat close to shore. I jumped just as I felt something whoosh behind me, the monster's claws missing me by inches. I landed hard in the boat, and Tom gunned the engine. The creature lunged after us, but our boat was faster. As we sped away, I looked back to see it rise up out of the water one last time, its roar echoing across the lake. We made it back to the ranger station just as the sun was coming up. When we told our story, the park officials decided to close off that part of the lake. They said it was because of unsafe underwater structures. But we knew the truth. I quit the lake patrol the next week. Some people say I was a coward for leaving, but they weren't there that night. They didn't see what I saw. Sometimes late at night, when I hear strange sounds coming from across the water, I remember those glowing yellow eyes, and I know that somewhere out there, in the deepest parts of Voyageurs National Park, something is still swimming, waiting for the next boat to come too close to its territory. My name is Douglas Harrison, and I've been working as a trail maintenance ranger at Shenandoah National Park for nearly 15 years now. Some folks might find it boring to walk the same paths day after day, checking for fallen trees and broken signs, but I love every minute of it. There's something peaceful about being out here in the quiet of the woods, listening to the birds sing and the leaves rustle in the wind. I lead a small team of 4 other rangers, Mike, Sarah, Tom, and Dave. We're like a little family out here in the wilderness. Every morning we meet at the ranger station, grab our tools, and head out to keep the trails safe for visitors. Mike always brings coffee for everyone. Sarah tells the worst jokes you can imagine. Tom knows every bird call in the park, and well, Dave just likes to complain about everything, but we love him anyway. Last week everything changed. It started when we got news about a landslide on one of the oldest trails in the park. It wasn't a trail we used much anymore. Most folks stuck to the newer, wider paths. But something about this landslide felt different. When we got there, the whole hillside had come down, taking trees and rocks with it. But that's not what caught my eye. There, sticking out of the mud, were these weird stone markers I'd never seen before. They looked ancient, with strange carvings that didn't match anything I'd seen in my years at the park. I remember touching one of them and feeling this odd chill run down my spine. If I'd known then what was about to happen, I would have turned around and never looked back. But I didn't know. None of us did. And that's how our nightmare began. That first day after finding the markers, we started clearing the landslide. It was normal work at first, moving branches, checking for loose rocks, the usual stuff. But then Sarah noticed something weird. There were these huge tracks in the mud, bigger than anything we'd ever seen in the park. They looked like lizard tracks, but that couldn't be right. The biggest lizards we get around here are tiny little skinks that could fit in your hand. "Hey, Doug," Sarah called out. "Come look at this." I walked over and my stomach did a funny flip when I saw those tracks. They were fresh, the edges still sharp in the wet ground. Whatever made them had to be heavy. The prints were deep, like something weighing hundreds of pounds had passed through. Tom, who usually had an answer for everything, just shook his head. "Those aren't bear tracks. They're not deer. I've never seen anything like this." We kept working, but everyone was jumpy. Dave swore he heard something moving in the thick bushes behind us, but when we looked, there was nothing there. The weird thing was, all the usual forest sounds had stopped. No birds chirping, no squirrels running around, just dead silence. I radioed back to the main station to report what we'd found. But the radio just crackled with static. We were in a part of the park where reception could be spotty, so I didn't worry too much about it then. That was my second mistake. My first was not trusting my gut when it told me to get my team out of there. As the sun started to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Mike found another set of those strange stone markers. These ones had different carvings. They looked like warnings. There were rough pictures of what looked like giant lizards, and symbols that seemed to be telling people to stay away. We should have listened to those warnings. We really should have. But instead, we made camp for the night, planning to continue our work the next day. None of us knew that something was watching us from the darkness, something that had been waiting a very, very long time for people to find its trail again. That night around the campfire, nobody talked much. We could all feel something wasn't right, but none of us wanted to say it out loud. I kept thinking about those tracks and trying to convince myself they were just from some normal animal that got a bit deformed in the mud. Around midnight, we heard it for the first time, a low, rumbling sound, like a growl, but deeper than any bear I'd ever heard. It came from somewhere in the darkness, beyond our campfire's light. Dave jumped up, shining his flashlight into the trees. But all we saw were shadows moving in ways that shadows shouldn't move. "We should leave," Sarah whispered. "First thing in the morning, we should pack up and go." I agreed with her, but then Mike spoke up. "Doug, remember those old stories about this part of the park? About how the Native Americans wouldn't come here? Maybe those stone markers were trying to tell us why." Before I could answer, we heard a crash in the underbrush, much closer this time. Tom's flashlight caught something that made my blood run cold. A massive, scaly tail disappearing behind a boulder. It had to be at least 12 feet long. Nobody slept that night. We sat back to back in a circle, our flashlights pointed out into the darkness. Every now and then, we'd hear heavy footsteps circling our camp and see trees moving when there wasn't any wind. The thing out there, whatever it was smart. It was testing us, learning about us. When the sun finally came up, we found huge claw marks on the trees around our camp, higher than any of us could reach. And worse, our radio was smashed to pieces, and so were our cell phones that we'd left in our backpacks. This wasn't some random animal. This thing knew exactly what it was doing. I gathered everyone close. "We need to get out of here. Now. Leave everything except water and emergency supplies. We'll head straight back to the ranger station." But as we looked around, trying to figure out which way to go, we realized something terrible. The trail we'd come in on was gone. The landslide must have started moving again during the night, cutting off our way back. We were trapped in the back country, with that thing out there watching us, and no way to call for help. That's when we heard Tom scream. Tom's scream came from behind a cluster of trees. We all ran toward the sound, but by the time we got there, he was gone. All we found was his hat on the ground and broken branches everywhere, like something big had crashed through them. "Tom!" Sarah yelled, but I quickly put my hand over her mouth. "Don't," I whispered. "It'll hear us." We huddled together, our backs against a large rock. That's when we saw it clearly for the first time. Through a gap in the trees, about 50 yards away, was the biggest lizard I'd ever seen. It looked like a Komodo dragon, but it was the size of a car. Its gray-brown scales blended perfectly with the rocks, and its yellow eyes. Those eyes looked intelligent. It was holding something in its mouth. Tom's backpack. Mike started crying quietly. Dave looked like he was about to throw up, but Sarah, she kept her cool and whispered, "Those stone markers, Doug, they're not just random, they're marking its territory. Our ancestors must have known about this thing." We watched in horror as the creature moved with surprising speed through the forest, barely making a sound despite its massive size. It was a perfect hunter, using the rocks and trees for cover. This wasn't just some dumb animal, it was playing with us. We tried to move quietly through the forest, looking for any way out. But every time we thought we found a path, we'd hear that deep growl or see movement ahead, forcing us to change direction. It was hurting us, I realized, pushing us exactly where it wanted us to go. "The high rocks," I whispered to the others. "If we can get up there, maybe we can spot the ranger station." It was our only chance. But as we started moving that way, Dave panicked. "I can't do this," he said. And before any of us could stop him, he turned and ran. We heard his footsteps pounding on the ground, then a terrible roar, a scream, and silence. Now there were just 3 of us, me, Sarah, and Mike. We were tired, scared, and running out of water. The sun was starting to set again, and we all knew what that meant. The creature was even stronger in the dark. "We're not going to make it, are we?" Mike asked, his voice shaking. I gripped his shoulder. "Yes, we are. But we have to be smarter than it is. We have to." That's when we heard the growl again. But this time it wasn't coming from ahead of us. It was coming from right behind us. Everything happened so fast. We all ran in different directions as the creature lunged. I heard Mike scream, "Run!" and Sarah shouting something I couldn't make out. By the time I looked back, Mike was gone, just gone, like Tom and Dave before him. I found Sarah hiding behind a fallen tree. Her face was white with fear, but her eyes were fierce. "We need to fight back," she whispered. "We can't just keep running." She was right. I pulled out my knife. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. Sarah grabbed a thick branch from the ground. We could hear the creature moving around us, its scales scraping against the rocks and trees. "Those old markers," Sarah said quickly, "they all point to a cave up there." She nodded toward a cliff face ahead of us. "Maybe that's where it lives. Maybe there's something there that can help us." We moved as quietly as we could, but the creature was smart. Every time we thought we were getting closer to the cliff, we'd hear it circling around, trying to cut us off. The sun was almost gone now, and our flashlights were getting dim. Then Sarah spotted it, a dark opening in the rocks, the cave entrance. But just as we started running toward it, we heard that terrible growl right behind us. Sarah pushed me forward. "Go," she yelled. "I'll hold it off." "Sarah, no!" But she was already turning, swinging her branch at the massive shape that burst from the trees. The branch connected with a loud crack, and the creature roared in pain. Sarah looked back at me one last time. "Find a way to stop it, Doug. Don't let anyone else come here." Those were her last words. I ran into the cave, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The beam of my flashlight showed more stone markers inside, their carvings telling an ancient story. They showed people fighting the creature, trying to trap it. And there, at the back of the cave, I saw something that made my heart stop. Old spears with metal tips, covered in a dark liquid that could only be poison. The growling got closer. I grabbed one of the spears, knowing I would only get one chance. As the creature's massive head appeared in the cave entrance, its yellow eyes glowing in the dark, I thought about my team. Tom, Dave, Mike, Sarah. They were counting on me to end this. The creature charged, and I stood my ground. I don't remember much about what happened next, just flashes. The creature charging at me, the poisoned spear leaving my hands, a roar that shook the whole cave, and lots of blood. I remember the creature thrashing around, its huge tail smashing against the cave walls, and then finally, after what seemed like forever, it stopped moving. I sat there in the dark for a long time, my flashlight barely working anymore. The massive shape of the creature lay still, its scales slowly turning gray as the poison did its work. It looked ancient, like something from a time when the world was a much wilder place. Part of me felt sad. This might have been the last of its kind, surviving all alone in these mountains for who knows how long. When I finally made it back to the ranger station the next morning, I was covered in dirt and blood. I told them about the landslide, about losing my team. But I didn't tell them about the creature. Who would believe me? They searched for days, but never found my friends' bodies. The official report said it was a bear attack. I helped them close off that whole section of the park. We put up signs saying it was unsafe because of landslides. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing by keeping the truth secret. But then I think about those ancient stone markers, put there by people long ago who tried to warn us. They knew some things are better left alone. I still work at the park, but I don't lead teams anymore. I can't. Not after what happened. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I think I hear that deep growl coming from the closed-off area, and I wonder, was that creature really the last of its kind? The old trail is gone now, buried under rocks and trees, but the stone markers are still there, hidden under the earth, waiting. And sometimes, when I see hikers looking at maps of the park's back country, I make sure to point them toward the safer trails, because I know what's out there in the deep woods, and I know that some trails should stay closed forever.